Namaste and welcome to Indian History and Archaeology with me, Dr. Lajavanti Shani. First off, let me apologize for the long break in our videos, which happened due to unavoidable reasons. Now, as the title of this video says, I will be attempting to bust a few myths and the false narrative of Indian history. I said attempting because almost everything that we've learned about our country seems to be tainted. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I get to the point. Until a couple of years ago, when I was teaching history to high school students, I thought my biggest challenge was keeping teenagers interested in the subject. But then I found out that parents hated history more. Not only that, they actively discouraged their children from taking any interest in the subject. The common question in PTMs used to be, how will learning history help my child in his future career? My answer was always that if we don't know our past, then we will not be able to develop towards our future. There is a reason why most Indians find learning about our history so torturous. Our history textbooks, in particular, are designed to be uninteresting. Moreover, by cutting out the most significant parts of our ancient history and sanitizing the invasions and minimizing our resistance to these invaders, they propagate and promote a false narrative of Indian history. Let me just briefly read out to you the contents of this textbook, which is for grade 7 in the ICSE board. Chapter 1, Rise of Christianity. Chapter 2, Spread of Christianity. Chapter 3, Rise and Spread of Islam. Chapter 4, Turkish Invasion of India. Then there's one page on India before the Turkish invasion. Chapter 5, the Delhi Sultanate. Again, one page, a story from history. Chapter 6, Life in the Sultanate period. Chapter 7, the regional kingdoms. Again, one page on the splendor of Hampi. Another page on Tenali Rama's adventure. Chapter 8, the coming of the Mughals. Chapter 9, the Great Akbar, a case study. Chapter 10, the Mughal Empire after Akbar. Another page on Inside the Red Fort. Chapter 11, the Bhakti and Sufi movements. Which part of this history would actually fascinate an Indian student? If you can find this book and take a look at it, the first 3 or 4 chapters, in fact, are just propagating religions. I didn't know schools were meant to do that. Okay? Then, when you're talking about the Islamic invasions in India, the resistance given by the Indian kings has been played down so pathetically, saying that there was no unity and that was it. There's nothing said about the fight put up by Indian rulers to any of the invaders. I understand that the textbook for grade 8 is about ancient Indian civilization and the cultures from the pre-Islamic period. But this is where the child's brain has already been set. Unlike what is being projected in the new liberal arts approach, we urge you to look at both narratives, one created by the British and followed up later by the post-independence educationists, and the other, which is more recent, revivalist. Build your awareness by reading or listening to experts. Evaluate both perspectives and draw your own conclusions. As far as myths are concerned, at the top of my list is the Aryan invasion theory, or AIT as we call it, which was actually the creation of one of the officers from Nazi Germany. They propagated this myth for their heinous genocide of the European Jews. But the British actually used it in India to continue their own agenda of colonization. The Aryans were supposedly blue eyed, fair skinned, horse riding raiders who entered India from the west, and they brought Sanskrit, which was an Indo Aryan language. They also brought Hinduism into India. They apparently invaded and destroyed the Indus Valley civilization and enslaved the indigenous people, also known as Dravidians, calling them Dasyas or Dasyus. So, if you see the purpose of utilizing this myth in India, what the British told us was that they were not the first to conquer India, they were not the first to subjugate India. There were others, other Europeans before them. Also, remember, blue eyed, fair skinned raiders from the West. So, India has always been conquered, India has always been ruled by the West. That's what they try to show there. But the British used the Aryan invasion theory to legitimize their colonization of India. Contradicting this is the new thought which has been rising within India in the past few decades, even going further to suggest an OIT or out of India theory, which may or may not be too far fetched. At the very least, this school of thought says that the Harappans and the Vedic people lived together or simultaneously within the Sindhu Saraswati region, or possibly even beyond these two rivers. So, in the east, we have settlements right up till the Ganga Jamuna Doab. In the south, we have settlements right into Maharashtra. And similarly, we have a lot of other settlements in the north, in the northwest, and the west, of course. All of these areas actually show us Harappan presence in archaeological material. These areas are also described in the Vedic literature, which is the Rig Veda, and later on in the Ramayana and Mahabharata as well. In my previous presentations, I have talked about how the Harappans traveled to the west with their trade. The out of India theory suggests that a group or groups of Vedic people also may have traveled to the west. This westward migration may have carried along with it the Sanskrit language, the worship of Vedic gods and goddesses, which we do actually see in some of the Western cultures later on, much after the Harappans and the Vedic period also, in the Mitannis in Central Asia or closer to West Asia, as well as a few other cultures. As for the destruction of Harappan cities, we have absolutely no archaeological evidence whatsoever. This theory originated from Max Muller and then was supported by Alexander Cunningham using the 7 skeletons which were found in the streets of Mohenjo-daro. That's not enough evidence to support any kind of invasion. 100 years ago, European Indologists like Max Muller had interpreted Vedic words like Purundar or Purinder to mean that Indra was the destroyer of forts. The AIT, which has been debunked by Indian scholars, archaeologists as well as Indologists, served a purpose for the British using the theory of white man's burden, which means to civilize the rest of the world. But in doing so, they also created a chasm between the north and south in India by proclaiming that the Dravidians or South Indians were the original Harappans. Remember one thing, history has always been written by the conquerors, the winners, in which case the Vedic people should have been bragging about their valor and conquests in the Rig Veda. We don't see any of that. Instead, the Rig Veda talks about the geography of this land, of the Saraswati and Sindhu region where they performed yagnas. Keep in mind that our vast literature does talk about far off places like Gandhara and other kingdoms in the west as well as the east. However, the Vedas do not talk of travelers going to the west. So at this point, the OIT might just be a conjecture, or it is even possible that the migration may have happened after the Vedas were written. Again, in one of my previous presentations, I talked about how there were wars taking place in Mesopotamia during the later part, which probably was one of the reasons why the trade broke down. Of course, with climate being another major reason for the breakdown of trade and the Sindhu Saraswati civilization as well, in all probability, there were migrations taking place with people leaving this region to move towards the west, north, or east as well. Our antiquated education system and the research books have been inherited from the British Raj and completely ignores research done in the past 100 years. There were scholars even during that period who spoke differently but were never heard or never featured in our textbooks or even suggested as part of our reading. But now, 70 years after our independence, we are at the cusp of meaningful change, especially with our new education policy. We hope to see a change in the perspective, but in the meantime, let's hear it from researchers themselves. The second on the list of these myths to be busted, the Rig Vedic Aryans who were outsiders brought Hinduism to India, as I said earlier, while the natives were nature worshippers and forest dwellers, Adivasis. Now, to begin with, if you say that the Vedic Aryans invaded India, conquered the Harappan region, they destroyed the Harappan cities, the Harappan civilization, well, the Harappans were urban people, not forest dwellers. Also, one of the Pancha Mahayagnas given in the Vedic lifestyle includes service to nature and other living beings. Hindus also worship healing trees and plants such as peepal, tulsi, and vad in Maharashtra. Feeding animals and birds, looking after them, is also part of worship or yajna. The third myth I'd like to pick apart today is that ancient India was a rigid Brahmanical society with its caste system, and the Vedic religion was riddled with superstitions. The word caste comes from Portuguese and Spanish casta, which means lineage, which has historically been used as a racial and social identifier by the Europeans. The British used it to segregate the Hindu population in its first ever census, which was carried out in 1891. by pigeonholing people into certain castes, tribes, or sects. For centuries until then, the Vedic society has used the four varnas and multifold jatis, which in actuality were trade guilds with groups of people specializing in a certain set of skills or trades, such as potters, carpenters, ironsmiths, fishermen, cowherds, etc. In the earlier times, these varnas and jatis were mobile and fluid, as we know from the Upanishads or Vedantas, which came at the end of the Vedas. We do, however, come across mentions of abuse of this system from the early historic period onwards, which is when Buddhism emerged in India. But clearly, the jatis had at this point of time become more rigid, meaning people from one guild were not allowed to move into another profession. As for superstitions, many of the Vedic observations have been recognized by scientists today, from space to healthcare and more. Now let's come to Emperor Ashoka, who has been praised in our history textbooks and portrayed as the only king who gave up everything that he had conquered after winning a war. What is the lesson being driven home here? That a king who gives up his territory is a good king? This brings to my mind a more modern war between India and Pakistan, but we shall not go there now. As for Ashoka, whatever has been taught to us in our school and college textbooks, he did not give up violence after the Kalinga War. In fact, he was extremely brutal to the Brahmins. Also, if you look at it in another way, promoting Buddhism abroad could also be seen as a form of cultural conquest. And then there's the history of the invasion of Sindh or the conquest of Sindh and Raja Dahir Singh of Sindh, who does not exist in our textbooks. Or at the very most, he is only mentioned in a single sentence. This part of Indian history simply does not exist. Very few people outside of the Sindhi community even know about the existence of this Rajput king. The only known historical source about the conquest of Sindh is the Chachnama, which is an Arabic text written by a courtier of that period. What about the Indian writers of that period? Have they recorded the conquest of Sindh? We need a lot more research on this chapter of our history. Moreover, the current textbooks simply gloss over this event with a one-liner about Sanskrit texts being taken to Damascus to be translated into Arabic. It goes without saying, of course, that they would have enslaved and taken Brahmins with them who could read and interpret these texts for them. Another king who also does not find any place in our textbooks is Raja Suheldev of Shravasti from central India. This legendary king of a small kingdom is known to have defeated and killed a Ghaznavid general after waves upon waves of invasion had completely broken through the western parts of India and reached central India. To tell the truth, I hadn't even heard about this anywhere until the Indian author Amish Tripathi published his book based upon King Suheldev. Besides being mentioned by Jahangir's courtier Chishti, who had penned down a chronicle on the Turkic invaders, Suheldev has only been mentioned in local legends. And now listen to this one carefully. Alauddin Khilji of the Delhi Sultanate was a savior of the Hindus. He fought and defeated the invading hordes of Mongols who were the scourge of China, Russia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, West Asia, and even Eastern Europe. The Mongols had burned Islamic libraries in many of these places and killed millions of Muslims in the Middle East. Khilji saved Hindus from a similar fate. He saved our temples, our books, our culture. Khilji saved the Hindu civilization from extinction. Frankly, I have no words to respond to this one. Our textbooks have completely sanitized Khilji's battles with the Indian rulers and his reign, not to mention any of his atrocities. But this particular historical record comes from cyber sources of all things, such as the Wikipedia, the Wire, this article in the Wire, the Mongol invasions, and actually says that India should be thankful to him, should be grateful to this man for saving all of our population, which includes Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, from all walks of life who would have been completely annihilated by the Mongols. And this, of course, comes in the midst of his attacks on other rulers in India, where he looted their wealth. And this article, of course, is in response to the movie Padmavati. And then, of course, it goes on to say while the world could not stand up to the Mongols, it was Khilji who actually destroyed the Mongols. Of course, there is no doubt at all that these kind of articles are not recognized as historical sources of any sort, but the fact remains that they set a narrative. The history of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj has also been distorted to a large extent, and most of the warriors of the Maratha Empire and their accomplishments are virtually unknown to us today. Unless you're a history buff, there is very little chance that you would have heard of these brave warriors outside of Bollywood or even the television serials today. And we all know that these scripts are written for the box office and TRPs, not authenticity. In other words, they can be fictions in the garb of historicals. For example, have you heard about Maratha warriors like Kanhoji Angre, admiral of the Maratha Blue Water Navy, which was a scourge of the Portuguese and British seafarers, or Sardar Pillaji Rao Jadhav? So, to conclude today's talk, I will say that the glorification of Mughal history in India has come at the cost of ancient Indian history, culture, society, architecture, temples, and religions, all of which have been either completely omitted, sidelined, or eclipsed. This, of course, includes Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Adivasis. In our contemporary history of the 20th century, we had nationalists like Dadabhai Navroji, Lokmanya Tilak, Annie Besant, Madame Kama, Lala Lajpat Rai, Subhash Chandra Bose, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and so many other freedom fighters. Again, that part of our history is also eclipsed today to the point where our children have absolutely not heard of so many of these names. In fact, did you know that Tilak was considered an extremist in the Indian National Congress? He gave out the clarion call of Swaraj Maja Janmasiddha Adhikar Ahe, Anito Mi Ghenar, or self-governance is my birthright. Swaraj is my birthright, and that I shall take. This was, of course, juxtaposed against the moderates who believed that India was not ready for independence and it should remain as the dominion of the British. Almost until the time of our independence, this was the thought which guided our freedom struggle. I hope to leave you with enough thought to chew on, and I hope you will be interested enough in reading and finding out more for yourself too. If you've liked this video, then please do let us know in the comments below this video as well. And if you're still questioning as to why we need to know about our country's past, I would like to say, join us on this exciting journey to find out more and take pride in our country's rich past. Thank you and namaste. If you'd like to watch more such videos, then please consider subscribing to the channel and click on the bell icon.